Sophia's shift at Marcello's began like every other Wednesday evening, with her arriving through the service entrance at 4:47 p.m., 14 minutes before the doors officially opened to Miami's elite. She pulled her dark hair into a tight bun, secured with the same pearl pin her mother had given her 7 years ago, back when Catherine could still fasten buttons without trembling hands. The uniform hung loose on Sophia's frame these days. Not from illness, but from the particular poverty of working 60-hour weeks on a salary that barely covered her mother's medication and the monthly fees at Clearview Assisted Living Facility, a 30-minute drive from the city that cost $200 every month without fail. That morning, before her shift, she had visited Catherine. The visits happened 3 times each week, Mondays, Wednesdays, and Saturdays, a schedule Sophia maintained with the precision of someone who understood that consistency was the only promise she could reliably keep. Catherine had been lucid that day, which meant she recognized Sophia's face, even if the context of their relationship had become somewhat fuzzy in her deteriorating mind. They sat in the facility's common room, which smelled perpetually of industrial cleaner and something underneath it, something organic and sad that Sophia had learned not to identify too closely. "You work too hard," Catherine had said, her fingers working at the hem of her cardigan nervously. Her hands moved constantly now, as if they were searching for something to do, some small task that might anchor her to present consciousness. "It's fine, Mom. You're comfortable there. That's what matters." Catherine had nodded, but Sophia could see the guilt flickering behind her mother's increasingly distant eyes. Catherine knew, on some level, that her existence required sacrifice. That knowledge lived alongside the advancing confusion, like 2 separate realities, refusing to fully merge. By next month, the realization might vanish entirely. Sophia had learned not to predict these deteriorations. They happened in their own time frame, following rhythms that had nothing to do with logic or fairness. The restaurant's kitchen was already buzzing with activity when Sophia entered. Marcus, the head chef, didn't look up from his prep work. He never did. Marcus had trained under someone in New York for 15 years before moving down to Miami, and he had a chef's particular disdain for front-of-house staff. Sophia didn't take it personally. She took it as the baseline of her professional existence, the same way one accepts gravity or the inevitability of Tuesday following Monday. She collected her order book and server's notepad, mentally rehearsing the evening's specials. The restaurant was expecting a full house. Valentine's Day was next week, and couples were beginning their preliminary reconnaissance missions, testing restaurants before committing to the more substantial romantic gestures of the actual date. Marcello's was where people went when they wanted to be seen, which meant it was where power moved through subtle conversations held over wine and carefully plated food. The last thing Sophia did before taking her position was apply the perfume. She kept the bottle in her locker, wrapped in a small velvet pouch that had come with it. The perfume itself was housed in a crystal vessel that looked like it belonged in a museum, rather than a locker room adjacent to a restaurant's kitchen. The glass was so precise, so intentional, that Sophia had never managed to examine it without thinking of craftsmanship from another era, from another world entirely. Her grandmother Victoria had given it to her 2 months ago, during those final days in the hospice facility when the morphine had worn off for just enough hours to allow Victoria to think clearly. Victoria was Sophia's only grandparent. Her other 3 had died before Sophia's birth or early in her childhood, leaving Victoria as the sole remaining link to whatever genealogy and family history Sophia might have claimed. Catherine had never been particularly forthcoming about relatives. Sophia had learned not to press the subject. "This is important," Victoria had said, pressing the crystal bottle into Sophia's hands with surprising strength for someone so diminished by illness. "This is—" She had paused then, gathering words that seemed to resist organization. "When someone recognizes this, when someone knows it, you'll understand things. About your family. About why I kept you safe." The statement had confused Sophia at the time. Kept her safe from what? Victoria had never been cryptic before. She had been direct, practical, the kind of woman who called things by their actual names rather than dancing around inconvenient truths. But the cancer had been thorough in its reorganization of Victoria's mind, breaking down linear thinking into fragments and philosophical abstractions. "What does it mean?" Sophia had asked. "It means your life wasn't random," Victoria had said. Then she had slipped back into the fog, and by evening, she was gone. Sophia had worn the perfume only twice since then, once to the funeral, and once when the despair of the month had felt particularly suffocating. But tonight, for no reason she could clearly articulate, she had applied it before work. Just a small amount on her wrists and the hollow of her throat, where the pulse beat visibly against her pale skin. The scent was unusual, not floral in any conventional way, though there was definitely a flower at its heart, something that didn't have a name Sophia recognized. The bass notes were warm, woody, reminding her of walking through an old library or entering a church that had stood for centuries. There was amber in there somewhere, and something that might have been leather, or might have been something else entirely. It was a scent that seemed designed to communicate complexity rather than simple pleasure. Every time she breathed, she detected something new in its composition, as if the perfume was a small symphony that kept reorganizing itself. By 5 p.m., the restaurant had filled to about 40% capacity. Sophia moved through her section with the automatic grace of someone who had internalized the choreography of service so thoroughly that her body could manage it, while her mind occupied itself with other concerns. She water glasses at precise angles. She presented menus with her left hand. She recommended the risotto to people who wanted to seem adventurous without actually risking anything unusual. It was during the second hour of service, around 6:45 p.m., that Marcus spoke to her directly. This was unusual enough that Sophia almost didn't register it at first. "Table 9's going to want something special tonight," he said, nodding toward the back of the dining room. "The man who just got seated in the corner. He comes maybe once every 3 months, always the same table, always private. He'll want something that isn't on the menu. Don't argue about it. Don't ask questions. Just bring him the best fish we have, prepared how I decide. The restaurant covers whatever he wants." Sophia followed Marcus's gaze toward the corner booth. Most of Marcello's corner tables were designed to be simultaneously prominent and isolated. They allowed the occupant to see and be seen, while still maintaining a buffer of space that prevented casual interaction with other diners. This particular booth was against the window, overlooking the street where palm trees lined the avenue, their fronds occasionally catching the wind like green flags signaling some distant war. The man seated there was striking in the way that certain predators are striking, the kind of magnetism that came from absolute stillness and control rather than obvious physical movement. He was approximately 35, maybe 36, with black hair that had been combed carefully back from a high forehead. His face had the kind of architecture that suggested Italian heritage, though Sophia knew that heritage was a complex thing, and racial characteristics were slippery categories that refused to remain stable under scrutiny. His jaw was notably square, the kind of jaw that looked carved rather than grown. His skin was olive-toned, unmarked by visible scars on his face, which was unusual for a man his age. He wore an expensive suit, gray, perfectly tailored, the kind of garment that cost more than Sophia's monthly rent. And he held a wine glass like someone who understood wine but didn't particularly care about it. What struck Sophia most was his eyes. Even from across the restaurant, she could perceive their color, a deep brown that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. His eyes moved across the room methodically, cataloging the space the way a person catalogs a building they're planning to occupy. He looked at people as if he was reading text written on their bodies, deciphering information that most individuals would consider private. Sophia realized she was staring. She adjusted her focus back to her current table, where a couple was discussing whether to split a dessert or order separately. She provided the expected gentle guidance. Splitting was romantic. Ordering separately was practical. Whichever they chose would be delicious, and moved toward the kitchen to place their order. But she could feel the man's attention now, prickling against her awareness like someone had touched the back of her neck lightly with a single fingertip. She didn't look at him again. She had worked in restaurants long enough to understand that sustained eye contact with certain patrons could be interpreted as invitation, and invitations created complications. Her life had enough complications without adding the unpredictable variables that came from attracting the attention of men who commanded entire restaurant sections simply by sitting down. At 7:15 p.m., Marcus gestured toward Sophia. "Corner table is yours now. Take him something to drink first. He usually takes a specific vintage. I'll have Daniel prepare it." Just stand there and wait for him to tell you what he wants to eat." Sophia nodded and moved toward the corner booth, wine list in hand and notepad ready. As she approached, the man looked up at her. The moment his eyes met hers, something shifted in the restaurant's atmospheric pressure. Other conversations seemed to grow quieter, or perhaps Sophia's attention simply narrowed so intensely that surrounding noise fell away. The perfume reached him before her words did. Sophia watched his body stiffen almost imperceptibly. His hands, which had been resting on the table, stilled completely. His eyes, those absorbing dark eyes, closed briefly, as if he was processing something that required all his sensory focus. "Good evening," Sophia said, her voice maintaining the professional flatness that service required. "Can I start you with something to drink this evening?" He opened his eyes, and when they met hers, Sophia felt the precise moment when recognition transformed into something else entirely. His expression didn't change. His body remained perfectly still. But behind his eyes, something was happening. Some internal calculation or recalibration that manifested as sudden, absolute concentration. "I'd like the Barolo," he said quietly. "The 1989 vintage. And I need the dining room cleared." His voice was low, measured, carrying the kind of authority that made the statement sound less like a request and more like a simple statement of fact. Sophia blinked. "I'm sorry? Everyone out," he said, still looking directly at her. "Now." The moment Luca Ravellini issued his command, the restaurant's carefully maintained performance of normalcy collapsed. Sophia stood frozen, her order pad dangling from her fingers like a useless prop from a play that had suddenly ended. The man didn't raise his voice. He didn't gesture or make any movement that could be interpreted as threatening, yet his words carried a weight that seemed to physically press against everyone present, a force that made heads turn toward the kitchen, toward the exits, toward the host stand where the manager stood with an expression that suggested he understood exactly what was being asked of him. "Sir, I'm not sure I understand," Sophia began, her professional training attempting to reassert itself, attempting to translate this impossible moment into something that could be managed through the protocols of hospitality. "We don't typically—" "Now," he interrupted, his gaze never wavering from her face. "Everyone leaves. Everyone except you. Folks, we're closing the dining room for a private safety procedure. Please gather your belongings and exit through the east corridor. We'll validate your parking and comp a bottle for your next visit." Couples abandoned their appetizers. A businessman collected his briefcase. The restaurant's ambient noise, the quiet clinking of glassware, the murmur of conversation, the distant sound of plating from the kitchen, began its rapid dissolution. Within minutes, the dining room had transformed from a crowded establishment into a stage set waiting for a scene that hadn't yet been written. The servers melted back into the kitchen. Marcus appeared briefly at the service window, took in the situation with a single glance, and disappeared again without comment. Through all of this, Luca Ravellini remained motionless. His hands rested on the table exactly where they'd been when Sophia approached, his body angled slightly toward the window. But his eyes tracked her with absolute focus, following her with the precision of something that hunted by watching, rather than by moving. When the last customer had exited and the host's stand fell silent, Luca rose from his seat. Sophia noticed that he moved with deliberate slowness, as though any sudden movement might shatter the fragile reality they'd entered. He was taller than she'd anticipated from the distance, well over 6 feet, with the kind of physical presence that seemed to displace air. His suit was even more impressive up close, the fabric and tailoring speaking to a relationship with money that went beyond mere spending. This was the wardrobe of someone who understood that clothing was a form of communication. "You're going to come here," he said quietly, his voice carrying an accent that Sophia couldn't immediately place. Not quite Italian, but European. Something older, layered with multiple languages. "And you're not going to speak until I ask you a question. You're going to stand there, and you're going to let me understand what I'm perceiving. Do you understand?" Sophia understood that she was no longer in control of this situation. She understood that the careful protocols of her employment had become irrelevant. She understood that something had shifted in the fundamental nature of her evening, and she had no framework for processing it. but she nodded, her throat dry, and stepped closer to his table. Luca closed his eyes. When he inhaled, Sophia watched his entire body respond to the scent. His shoulders tensed, his jaw clenched. A muscle beneath his right eye twitched almost imperceptibly. His hands, which had been relaxed, began to curl into fists before he consciously forced them back open against the table. "Where did you get this?" he asked, his voice lower now, almost hoarse. "The perfume." "Where?" "It was my grandmother's," Sophia heard herself say. Her voice sounded very far away, as though she was hearing it from outside her body. "She gave it to me before she died, 2 months ago." Luca's eyes opened. They locked onto hers with an intensity that was almost physical in its force, as though he was trying to read something in her irises that went deeper than simple information. He took another step closer, his face now only a few feet from hers. "Your grandmother's name," he said, not a question, a demand phrased as a statement. "Victoria," Sophia whispered. "Victoria Mitchell." The moment the name left her mouth, something fractured inside Luca's carefully maintained control. His entire body went rigid. His hand came up to his mouth as though he might be ill, then fell back to his side. He turned away from her abruptly, moving toward the window where the streetlights of Miami cast their sodium glow across his face. Sophia could see his chest rising and falling in a rhythm that suggested he was consciously controlling his breathing, forcing oxygen into his lungs through discipline rather than instinct. "Say it again," he said, still facing away from her. "The name." "Say it again." "Victoria Mitchell," Sophia repeated. She didn't understand why it was important, didn't understand why this man's reaction had shifted from controlled intensity to something approaching emotional dissolution. "She was my grandmother. She died of cancer. She gave me the perfume in the hospice." Luca stood motionless for a long time. His hand came up and braced against the window frame, and Sophia saw his knuckles whiten from the force of his grip. She became aware of the silence in the restaurant. A complete absence of sound that felt almost toxic. The kitchen had gone quiet. The staff had either hidden themselves or left entirely. It was just Sophia and this man, and the scent of the perfume hanging between them like a physical presence. "Did she ever speak about me?" he asked. His voice was different now, stripped of the authority and control that had characterized his initial command. There was something beneath it, something that sounded almost like desperation. Did she ever mention someone named Luca? Sophia's mind raced through her memories of Victoria. The quiet afternoons they'd spent together, the stories Victoria had shared about her youth, the careful silences when certain topics seemed to approach the edges of Victoria's consciousness before retreating again. "No," Sophia said. "She never mentioned anyone named Luca. I don't know who you are." He turned back toward her then, and Sophia saw something in his expression that terrified her more than his initial command had. It was the look of someone confronting something they'd thought was impossible, something they'd stopped believing in, something that was now standing directly in front of them and demanding to be acknowledged. "She had blue eyes," he said, "dark blue, almost navy, and her hands shook when she was thinking hard about something." He reached out, but stopped before touching her, his hand hovering near her face. "You have her bone structure, the line of your jaw. I didn't see it at first because I wasn't looking for it, but now I can see it clearly. Now I can see it everywhere." Sophia took a step backward, her professional survival instincts attempting to override her bewilderment. "I think you have me confused with someone else. I don't know you. I've never seen you before tonight." "No," he agreed, dropping his hand. "You haven't, but I know Victoria. I knew her very well, and if you're her granddaughter, then everything I thought I understood has just become impossibly more complicated." He moved back to his chair and sat, suddenly looking exhausted, like someone who had been running a distance and had only now allowed himself to stop. "What was her maiden name? Before Mitchell?" "Castillo," Sophia answered automatically. "Victoria Castillo. She married my grandfather. Castillo," he repeated softly, as though he was tasting the word, testing its authenticity against something in his memory. He nodded slowly, and when he looked at her again, his eyes were wet. He didn't cry, didn't allow tears to fall, but Sophia could see them gathering in the lower lids, threatening a breakdown that his will was barely containing. "Sit down, Sophia. You need to sit down, because what I'm about to tell you is going to change everything you believe about your family." He gestured to the chair across from him. Sophia moved toward it mechanically, her body functioning on automatic systems, while her mind struggled to process how a Wednesday evening had transformed into whatever this moment had become. As she sank into the chair, Luca exhaled slowly, and the sound carried the weight of decades of a secret, finally, impossibly, being spoken aloud. The restaurant had become a tomb, and Sophia was beginning to understand that she was not going to walk out of Marcello's the same way she had walked in. The doors remained locked. The staff had vanished into the kitchen or the back corridors, leaving only the sound of the air conditioning and the occasional distant clang of cookware being stored away. Luca Ravellini had settled back into his chair with the composure of a man accustomed to controlling entire environments through the force of his will alone. His eyes tracked Sophia's movements with predatory precision, not threatening exactly, but not comforting either. She remained standing, her posture rigid, her hands gripping the edge of the table as though physical contact with solid matter might anchor her to sanity. "Sit," he said quietly. It was not a suggestion. Sophia found herself moving before her conscious mind had approved the action, pulling out the chair across from him and lowering herself into it as though moving through water. "Tell me about Victoria. Everything. I want to know how she lived, what she did, who she became. I want details that don't appear in public records. I want to know the woman, not just the outline of her existence." Sophia's mouth was dry. She licked her lips before attempting to speak, aware that Luca was watching this small gesture with the kind of attention most people reserved for far more significant information. "I don't understand what you want me to tell you," she said. Her voice sounded weak to her own ears, attenuated by fear and confusion. "You already seem to know her. You clearly knew her well. Why are you asking me these questions as if, because I need to hear it from you?" Luca interrupted. His tone was controlled, but there was an undercurrent of something beneath the words. Something that might have been pain, or loss, or rage, carefully modulated into civility. "Because hearing it from her granddaughter changes the context of what I already know. Because every piece of information about her life in these past 28 years is a piece I don't have. Start with how she died." Sophia began to talk, surprising herself with the coherence that emerged from her fractured state of mind. She described the cancer, pancreatic, the kind that was aggressive and thorough in its destruction. She described the hospice facility, the way Victoria had spent her final weeks in a room that smelled of antiseptic and morphine, where visitors filtered in and out carrying flowers that seemed obscene in their cheerfulness given the circumstances. She described how Victoria had become progressively less present, how her mind had seemed to retreat into itself, leaving only fragments of the woman Sophia had known in the vehicle of her body. She was lucid sometimes, Sophia found herself saying. The morphine would wear off, or the doctors would adjust it, and she'd have these windows of clarity. But they were getting shorter. By the end, there was maybe an hour a day when she seemed like herself. I tried to visit during those times. The hospice staff would call me and tell me she was having a clear moment, and I'd rush over from work or from my apartment, trying to catch whatever time I could have with her while she was still present. Luca was listening with an intensity that suggested every word was being catalogued and processed, filed away in some internal database. "What was the last thing she said to you?" he asked. "Before she gave you the perfume, what were her last coherent words?" Sophia closed her eyes, pulling the memory up from the depths of her consciousness where she'd tried to bury it under the weight of grief. She said that my life wasn't random, that I should keep the perfume safe, that when someone recognized it, I would understand things about my family, about why she kept me safe. The moment the last phrase left her mouth, she saw Luca's entire body go rigid. His hands, which had been resting on the table, clenched into fists so tight that the tendons in his forearms became visible, straining against his skin. "She said that?" he asked, his voice reduced to something barely above a whisper. "Those exact words? That she kept you safe?" "Yes," Sophia confirmed. "I didn't understand what she meant at the time. I still don't understand what she meant, but she was very clear about it. She kept saying it like it was the most important thing she needed me to understand before she died. She was very weak at that point. The morphine had her drifting, but she kept pulling herself back to say it again. Kept saying the same thing, that she kept me safe, that the perfume would explain it. Luca stood up abruptly, pushing his chair back with enough force that it scraped against the restaurant floor with a sound that made Sophia flinch. He moved to the window, his silhouette framed against the Miami streetlights beyond the glass. His shoulders were heaving slightly, his breathing not quite controlled. Sophia watched him with the careful attention of someone observing a volatile substance, trying to anticipate which way it might explode. "Your grandmother was Victoria Castillo Mitchell," he said finally, his voice steady now, but hollow, as though he was speaking through a tunnel of exhaustion. "She married a man named Robert Mitchell when she was very young. That marriage produced your parent, who is still alive, I assume." "My mother," Sophia said. "Catherine. She's 47. She has degenerative neurological disease. She lives in a care facility." "And your father?" Luca turned to face her again. "I never knew him," Sophia said. "My mother never discussed him. He was never part of my life. Mother died when I was 5. Not actually died. She's still alive. But she became less present before I was even born, I think. By the time I was school age, I don't think she was capable of raising a child alone. So Victoria took over. I grew up thinking of Victoria as my primary family member." Luca moved to the table and retrieved something from his jacket pocket, a small leather case from which he extracted a business card. The card itself was expensive, embossed rather than printed, with raised lettering that Sophia could see even from across the table. It contained only a name, Luca Ravellini, and a telephone number with a local area code. There was no business title, no address, no indication of what services or industry might be connected to his name. "You're going to call this number tomorrow," Luca said, placing the card on the table between them. "You're not going to discuss this conversation with anyone. You're not going to research me or my background. You're going to call that number and speak only to me. Do you understand?" "I don't understand any of this," Sophia said, her voice rising slightly. "Who are you? How do you know Victoria? Why does my grandmother's perfume matter so much to you that you evacuate an entire restaurant? Why are you keeping me here against my will?" "You're not being kept against your will," Luca said, his tone suggesting that the distinction was important to him. "The door is unlocked. You can leave whenever you choose. But you won't leave because you're going to stay and listen to what I'm going to tell you now. And what I have to tell you requires you to hear it in this context, in this privacy, so that you can process it without the noise of the world trying to interrupt." He gestured for her to sit again. After a moment's hesitation, Sophia complied, her curiosity beginning to override her fear. There were answers here, she realized. Answers to questions she'd never thought to ask, to mysteries about her family that she hadn't known existed. Victoria's deathbed insistence that Sophia's life wasn't random suddenly seemed to carry more weight. "Your grandmother," Luca began, "was married once before Robert Mitchell. That marriage was brief and ended badly. During that time, she was connected to a family, a significant family, a family that did not approve of her relationship with my—" He paused, seeming to struggle with the word selection. "With a member of that family. She left that world. She tried to build a normal life. But the perfume she gave you is not a normal family heirloom. It is a signature. It is a marking. And the fact that you're wearing it means that she intended for you to be found." Sophia wanted to ask what he meant by found, but before she could form the question, Luca moved to the restaurant's front entrance and unlocked the door. He stepped back, creating a clear path to the exit. "It's 3 a.m, he said. "The street is empty. You can go home now. You can try to pretend this never happened, or you can call that number tomorrow and get answers to questions you're going to spend all night formulating. The choice is genuinely yours." Sophia gathered her things mechanically, her phone, her keys, her work notepad still clutched in her hand. She moved toward the door, her mind fracturing between the impulse to run and the impulse to stay and demand explanation. At the threshold, she turned back toward Luca. "Why should I trust you?" she asked. "You shouldn't," he said simply. Not yet. But you will, once you understand what Victoria was protecting you from. Call the number, Sophia. Everything becomes clear once you understand what that perfume represents. She stepped out into the Miami night, which had turned cold in the small hours of the morning. The street was indeed empty, the buildings dark, only scattered streetlights casting their sodium glow onto pavement that glistened from recent rain. As she walked toward the parking lot where her ancient Honda Civic waited, Sophia realized that Luca had never actually introduced himself, had never confirmed that his name was actually Luca Ravellini. She had only his word and his business card. But something in his desperation, something in the raw emotion she'd glimpsed beneath his controlled exterior, suggested that whatever this was, it had consumed him for a very long time. She clutched the business card in her fist as she drove home through the empty streets, the perfume still clinging to her skin, still carrying its secrets locked in its molecular structure, waiting for the right person to decode its meaning. Sophia didn't sleep. She sat on her bed with her laptop balanced on her knees, the glow of the screen the only light in her darkened apartment, and began the most meticulous research of her life. The business card sat on her nightstand, and she deliberately avoided looking at it, as though not acknowledging it might somehow make this situation less real. But her fingers moved across the keyboard with purpose, starting with the obvious query. The internet offered very little about Luca Ravellini. His name appeared in a few articles about crime in Miami, always mentioned in passing, always in connection with alleged activities and ongoing investigations. One article from a local news outlet dated 3 years prior referred to him as a figure of interest in organized crime operations. But the piece was vague on specifics, heavy on speculation, light on facts. The journalist had clearly been working from rumor and assumption rather than substantiated information. There were no photographs attached to his name, no social media presence, no professional biography or corporate listing. She pivoted her search. Isabella Ravellini. The name yielded more immediate results, though the information was dated. Articles from 20 to 30 years ago mentioned a woman named Isabella Ravellini who ran a private perfume operation in Miami. The business had never been incorporated formally, never sold products through retail channels, and had maintained what journalists at the time called an exclusive clientele. Photos showed an elegant woman with silver hair and sharp cheekbones, standing beside bottles of artisanal fragrance. One article from a lifestyle magazine circa 1995 featured an interview with Isabella, discussing the philosophy behind Perfume Ravellini. She explained that the fragrances were never for sale, only for gifting, only for those she deemed worthy of wearing a Ravellini creation. The formulas had been passed down through generations of women in her family, and she had no intention of commodifying them. The interviews stopped around 2000. A brief notice in an obituary column from 2010 confirmed that Isabella Ravellini had died at the age of 87. There was no public funeral listed, no charitable contributions in her name, no dramatic conclusion to her story. Just a woman who had existed quietly and then ceased to exist. Sophia searched for connections between the names. Victoria Castillo, Marco Ravellini. The marriage certificate appeared in a genealogy database that she accessed through Clearview's library system login credentials. Apparently, the facility maintained subscriptions to research resources for its residents' families. Victoria Castillo had married Marco Ravellini in 1978. The marriage was dissolved in 1991. No children were listed as products of that union on the public record. But Sophia had been born in 1996. She expanded the search parameters. Marco Ravellini appeared in connection with several business ventures throughout the 1980s and 1990s, none of them particularly legitimate sounding. Import-export operations, property holdings, vague corporate entities with names designed to obscure rather than clarify their function. In 2001, an obituary announced his death at age 42, attributed to complications from a prolonged illness. No mention of family. No surviving spouse listed. No survivors at all. She searched for Elena Ravellini next, following an instinct she couldn't quite articulate. The name yielded older records, dated 7 years prior. A woman named Elena Ravellini had been found dead in a residential property in Coral Gables. The death had been classified as suicide. The investigating police reports were sparse, but a local news story suggested that the circumstances had been questioned by some parties, though the article didn't elaborate on which parties or what questions they had raised. The photos showed a woman in her 30s, striking in appearance with dark hair and pale eyes. There was a brief mention that Elena had been involved with Miami's business community, and that persons connected to her had declined comment regarding the circumstances of her death. Sophia pulled up the police report itself, through a database she technically wasn't supposed to have access to, a remnant of a friend's password that she'd never deleted. The report was terse. Elena Ravellini had been found in her apartment by building management after a concerned neighbor reported unusual smells and lack of activity. The investigation concluded suicide via overdose. No note was recovered. No evidence of foul play was noted. The case was closed within 6 weeks, but something in the timing bothered her. Elena Ravellini dead 7 years ago. Luca Ravellini appearing in crime reports around the same period. Marco Ravellini having died a decade earlier. Victoria having been married to Marco, then divorcing him, then raising a daughter that the records suggested shouldn't exist. By 4 a.m., Sophia's eyes burned from screen exposure and exhaustion. She had filled 14 pages of her notebook with connections and questions and hypotheses that led nowhere conclusive. She understood that she was missing information, that there were gaps in the timeline and logic that she simply couldn't fill from publicly available sources. Victoria had said the perfume would explain things. Well, the perfume smelled like mystery and architecture, like something designed to communicate at a level that bypassed rational analysis. She was about to close her laptop when her email notification dinged. The sender line read simply, NR. The message contained only a few sentences. You research thoroughly. You're intelligent and cautious, which suggests good instincts. But you're also limited by what's available publicly. There are conversations that can only happen privately. Call the number on my card at 10 o'clock this morning. Not before, not after. Exactly 10. Sophia checked the timestamp. The email had been sent at 3:47 a.m., which meant he'd been monitoring her research, or at least monitoring her search history, or somehow had access to information about her digital activity. The violation of privacy was staggering enough to clear away the last remnants of her exhaustion. She was being watched, not just offered information, not just encountered randomly in a restaurant, actively tracked and monitored. She showered mechanically, dressed in clothes that felt like a costume, and sat at her kitchen table with the business card in front of her. At exactly 9:59 a.m., she picked up her phone. At exactly 10:80 a.m., she dialed the number. Luca answered on the first ring, as though he had been holding the phone, waiting for her call. You found information, he said. It wasn't a question. You found some of it, anyway. Some of the pieces that are available to find. Now you're going to come to a place where I can tell you the things that can't be found online. I'm sending a car for you. It will arrive at your address in 20 minutes. You'll ride in it until we reach a location where we can talk privately. You won't tell anyone where you're going. You won't bring a phone beyond the one you're holding right now. You won't bring weapons or recording devices or any attempt to protect yourself through documentation. You're going to come with only yourself and your genuine desire to understand. Do you agree to these terms? Sophia's rational mind screamed that this was dangerous, that she was making a catastrophic mistake, that every instinct for self-preservation should be propelling her toward calling the police or disappearing into anonymity. But she heard herself say, I agree. Good, Luca said. Then everything begins now. By the time this car arrives at your location, you will no longer be the person you were before you answered your phone. You understand that? No, Sophia said quietly. But I'm starting to. The line went dead. She looked at the clock on her wall. 10:03 a.m. She had 17 minutes to decide if she was actually brave enough to step into whatever this was, or if she should run. She didn't run. The car ride to Luca's mansion took 45 minutes, though Sophia wasn't entirely certain they were traveling in a linear path. The vehicle was tinted too darkly for her to see out, and the driver, a woman with silver hair and a professional demeanor, didn't engage in conversation beyond confirming Sophia's address and offering her water, which she declined. The silence was suffocating in its own way, giving Sophia nothing to focus on, except the mounting anxiety that accumulated with each turn the car made. When the vehicle finally stopped and the driver opened the door, Sophia emerged into a different version of Miami than the one she inhabited. The mansion stood behind wrought iron gates, visible only partially through landscaping that had been designed with precision to obscure rather than display. Palms and flowering shrubs created a buffer between the property and the street. The main structure was set back far enough that neighbors would have only glimpses of its architecture. Security cameras were discreetly positioned but clearly functional. This was a place designed by someone who understood that true power didn't announce itself through ostentatious display, but through deliberate concealment. The interior was understated in ways that suggested enormous wealth. Not the kind of wealth that needed to prove itself through marble floors and imported chandeliers, but the kind that manifested as thoughtfully chosen art, shelves lined with first editions, furniture that had been selected by someone with genuine aesthetic sensibility rather than a decorator's algorithm. Luca was waiting in what he called his study, though the room was far too comfortable to warrant such a formal title. 2 leather chairs faced each other across a low table. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked a garden that seemed impossibly lush for the Miami climate. "Sit," Luca said, gesturing to one of the chairs. He was wearing different clothes than he'd worn at the restaurant. Slacks and a button-down shirt in charcoal gray, the sleeves rolled up to his elbows. Without the formal suit jacket, he seemed somehow more accessible and simultaneously more dangerous. Like observing a weapon in its unguarded state, Sophia sat. Luca settled across from her, and for a moment they simply observed each other, as though trying to map the terrain of a conversation that would reshape both their lives. "Your grandmother was married to my brother," Luca began without preamble. His name was Marco Ravellini. The marriage lasted approximately 2 years, from 1978 to 1980. It ended because Victoria made a choice that was both brave and devastating. She chose to leave a world she didn't belong to, and in leaving that world, she left Marco behind. But before the marriage ended, before she understood what my family truly was, she became pregnant. Sophia felt the words land in her chest like something physical. "My mother," she said quietly. "Catherine." "Yes," Luca confirmed. "Catherine is Marco's biological daughter, which makes her my half-niece, which makes you my granddaughter by blood, though the biological pathways are somewhat circuitous. My brother didn't know about the pregnancy when Victoria left. She didn't tell him. She was afraid, and justifiably so, that if Marco knew she was carrying his child, he would use that knowledge to keep her connected to our family, connected to this world that she understood was built on practices and philosophies she found morally reprehensible." "How do you know this?" Sophia asked. "If Victoria didn't tell him, how would you know?" "Because Marco told me, years later, when he realized Victoria was never coming back," Luca said. "He had investigators locate her. He knew where she was living, what she was doing, who she had become. He discovered that she had given birth to a daughter and was raising that daughter alone. And Marco made a choice too. He chose not to interfere. He chose to let Victoria build the life she wanted without the weight of connection to us. It was perhaps the most noble thing Marco ever did, which tells you something about the caliber of decisions we were typically making." Sophia's mind was struggling to integrate this information into the framework she'd constructed for her identity. Catherine, whom she'd always believed to have a father who was simply absent or unknown, had a documented biological connection to the Ravellini family, which meant Sophia herself was not simply a random product of chance, but rather the result of a deliberate, documented lineage. "But there's more," Luca continued. "The perfume. Do you understand what it represents?" "I've been trying to figure that out," Sophia said. "I found articles about your grandmother, Isabella. She made it. She made it exclusively, never sold it. What does that have to do with me?" Luca stood and moved to a painting on the wall, a portrait of an older woman with elegant features and intelligent eyes. "This is Isabella," he said. "My grandmother. She died in 2010, though she lived until 2010, far longer than the cancer specialists thought she would. Isabella had a philosophy about perfume. She believed that scent was a form of communication, a way to mark family without using DNA tests or official documents. She believed that her perfume should only ever be worn by people she had explicitly chosen to be part of her legacy. He turned back to face Sophia. Before Marco died, and he did die, by the way, a decade before Isabella. Complications from illness, though the illness was partly the kind that comes from living a certain kind of life. Before he died, he told Isabella about Catherine, and Isabella did something extraordinary. She created a special batch of her perfume, one that had a slightly different composition than her usual work. She instructed Marco to ensure that this perfume was given to Victoria, with the understanding that it should eventually be passed down to Catherine, and potentially to Catherine's children. Why would she do that? Sophia asked. Why would she make something specifically for people who were trying to escape her family? Because Isabella was wise in ways that neither Marco nor I managed to be, Luca said. Because she understood that family isn't something that can be forced or coerced. She understood that the best legacy isn't one that demands loyalty, but one that offers recognition and choice. She believed that if her perfume ever resurfaced, if it appeared on someone from her bloodline, then that would be the signal that it was time to acknowledge what had been separated and see if it could ever be reconciled. Sophia touched the hollow of her throat, where the perfume still clung to her skin. Victoria gave it to me. She said that when someone recognized it, I would understand things about my family, about why she kept me safe. Exactly, Luca said. Victoria understood the significance of what Isabella had created. She had worn this perfume while she was married to Marco, and she knew that no one else wore it. So when Isabella gave it to her before Marco's death, yes, they communicated despite the separation. Victoria understood that it was both a blessing and a curse. A blessing, because it meant that Isabella had chosen to honor Catherine's existence. A curse, because it meant that if anyone from our family ever encountered someone wearing that scent, the connection would be undeniable. He returned to his chair and sat, leaning forward slightly. I grew up not knowing about Catherine's existence. Marco never told me until I was old enough to understand. I was 17 when he revealed it. I was already beginning to understand the nature of our family's business, the operations that funded our lifestyle, the methods we used to maintain power, and Marco's confession hit me like a betrayal of everything I thought our family was. What kind of operations? Sophia asked. She knew on some level, but she wanted to hear it articulated. Criminal enterprises, Luca said flatly. Money laundering through businesses that ostensibly operate legitimately. Debt collection through methods that exist outside legal frameworks. Connection to various trafficking operations that I won't detail, because you shouldn't carry that knowledge. My family is connected to organized crime, Sophia. We are not sophisticated businessmen who occasionally bend rules. We are criminals who maintain the facade of legitimacy. And when Marco told me about Catherine, what he was saying was that he had deliberately removed one person, his daughter, from this world, because he believed she deserved better than what we could offer her. Sophia felt something collapse inside her chest. The perfume on her skin suddenly felt like evidence, like proof of her complicity in something she hadn't chosen and didn't fully understand. Why are you telling me this? She asked. Why would you volunteer this information? Because yesterday evening, when I inhaled that perfume, I made a decision that I've been making and remaking for 28 years, Luca said. I decided that you deserve to know who you are. Not just the sanitized version that Victoria provided, but the full truth. Your blood connects you to criminals. Your grandmother made a choice to remove herself from that world, and your mother lived her entire life not knowing that part of herself that she came from. But you're at a decision point. You can choose to remain ignorant of this connection, or you can choose to understand it fully. And what happens if I choose to understand it? Sophia asked quietly. Then you understand that you're connected to something larger and more dangerous than your current life has prepared you for, Luca said. You understand that the FBI is interested in me, which means by extension they become interested in anyone close to me. You understand that there are people who would use you as leverage against me if they discovered our connection. But you also understand that you have access to protection and resources, and answers to questions that have always haunted your family. He paused, and his expression softened slightly. And you understand that there is someone in your life who has the capacity to care for you with an intensity that goes beyond normal human attachment. Someone who has spent 28 years carrying the knowledge of your existence like a secret weight. Someone who wants to know you, not as a symbol or a chess piece, but as a person. Sophia looked at him across the space between their chairs, and she understood that what she was witnessing was Luca Ravellini performing vulnerability in a way that probably cost him considerable effort. She understood that behind the measured words and controlled tone was a man who had been waiting for this encounter for most of his adult life. "I don't know how to process this," Sophia said. It was the truest thing she could articulate in the moment. "Then don't," Luca replied. "Not yet. Let it sit. Let it integrate itself into your understanding of reality. Tomorrow you'll visit your mother at Clearview, as you do every Saturday. On Monday, you'll return to work at Marcello's. You'll continue your normal life, but you'll also know the truth now. You'll understand why I reacted to your perfume the way I did. You'll understand that when I said I would ensure your mother's medical care was covered, I meant it as a statement of family obligation, not as an attempt at coercion." "How am I supposed to go back to my normal life knowing all of this?" Sophia asked. "The same way Victoria did," Luca said. "With difficulty, with constant awareness of the parallel world existing beneath the surface of the one you inhabit, with the understanding that some knowledge, once acquired, cannot be unacquired, but also with the knowledge that you now have the power to make informed choices about your own future." The car drove Sophia back to her apartment as the sun was setting, painting Miami in shades of orange and gold that seemed almost obscene in their beauty. She clutched the business card in her hand again, but this time it felt different. This time it felt like a tether. This time it felt like the beginning of something rather than the middle of a mystery. The 2 weeks following Sophia's visit to Luca's mansion existed in a state of fragmented normality that felt like performing in a play she hadn't auditioned for. She returned to Marcello's on Monday evening, and Marcus barely acknowledged her absence. The restaurant operated in its own universe of wealthy patrons and carefully orchestrated service, indifferent to the seismic shifts happening in individual staff members' lives. She took orders. She delivered plates. She managed the delicate choreography of hospitality that required her to be simultaneously present and invisible. But everything had changed. Sophia moved through her shifts with the awareness that she was being observed, that somewhere in the Miami evening, there were men whose job was to ensure her safety. She never saw them directly. There were no obvious security measures, no black cars following her, no sudden appearance of bodyguards. The protection was as invisible as the threat it was designed to counter. On Friday of that week, as she was clocking out after her shift, 2 individuals appeared at the employee entrance. They identified themselves as Special Agents Morrison and Park from the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Morrison was a woman in her 50s with steel gray hair and the kind of confidence that came from authority backed by institutional power. Park was younger, perhaps 40, with an expression that suggested he had perfected the art of appearing sympathetic while simultaneously conducting interrogation. "We'd like to ask you some questions about an incident at this restaurant approximately 2 weeks ago," Morrison said, producing a badge that Sophia studied with the careful attention of someone trying to process information that didn't make immediate sense. "There was a situation where a customer requested that the dining room be evacuated. We're looking for statements from anyone who was present." Sophia's mouth went dry. "I don't remember anything unusual," she said, which was technically true in the most literal sense. Everything about that night had been unusual. Nothing about it could be characterized as routine or noteworthy in the ways that fed into official reports. "You were working that evening," Park said. He was consulting a notebook, though Sophia suspected he already knew the answer. "You were assigned to the section where the customer in question was seated. The manager indicated that you served him directly before the evacuation occurred. He ordered the Barolo," Sophia said carefully. "He was a customer. He placed an order. I don't recall anything else." Morrison's eyes narrowed slightly. "The customer's name was Luca Ravellini. Do you know who that is?" The name hung in the air between them, and Sophia understood that this moment represented a threshold. Acknowledge the name and invite questions about her connection. Deny recognition and risk being caught in a lie that would damage her credibility. Say nothing, and hope the silence could be interpreted as confusion rather than evasion. "I'm a waitress," Sophia said finally. I serve customers. I don't track their names or backgrounds. If he wanted something, he ordered it and I delivered it. That's the extent of my interaction with him. Park exchanged a glance with Morrison. We're aware that Mr. Ravellini has been under investigation for various activities that exist outside legal boundaries. We're also aware that he has been documented visiting this establishment multiple times. We're interested in whether any conversations occurred between you and Mr. Ravellini that might provide insight into his current operations or associates. He ordered wine, Sophia repeated. We didn't have a conversation. He evacuated the restaurant and I went home. That's all I know. The questioning continued for another 20 minutes, circling around the same territory without advancing into new ground. Morrison and Park seemed increasingly frustrated as Sophia maintained her posture of professional detachment, offering nothing beyond the bare minimum of confirmation. Eventually, Morrison produced a business card with her contact information. If you remember anything, or if Mr. Ravellini attempts to contact you, we'd appreciate hearing about it, she said. We can offer protective measures if you feel you're being pressured or threatened. Sophia accepted the card and watched them leave. 40 minutes later, her phone rang. The caller ID showed an unknown number, but she answered it anyway. They visited you, Luca said without preamble. It wasn't a question. How do you know that? Sophia asked, though she already understood the answer. Because I know everything that happens to you. I told you that you were being protected. That protection extends to monitoring when federal agents decide to interview you. What did you tell them? Nothing, Sophia said. I said I served you wine, and that was the extent of our interaction. I didn't mention the perfume or Victoria or any of it. She heard Luca exhale, and the sound carried relief. Good. That was the correct response. By refusing to cooperate with them, you've made a statement. You've indicated that you're not interested in being a government cooperant. But Sophia, understand what this means. By protecting me, you've now involved yourself in my world in a way that creates legal liability. You're not just someone connected to me. You're someone who has actively chosen not to testify against me. I don't know if I had a choice, Sophia said quietly. You did, Luca replied. You could have told them everything. You could have made a deal. Immunity for testimony. You could have removed yourself from this situation entirely. But you didn't. And now I need to offer you something in return for that loyalty. He instructed her to come to the mansion on Saturday morning. When she arrived, she found not just Luca waiting for her, but a woman who introduced herself as Rosa. Rosa was in her mid-50s, with dark hair streaked with silver, and eyes that contained entire libraries of untold stories. She moved through the mansion with the ease of someone who had spent decades navigating its spaces and hierarchies. Your grandmother was my friend, Rosa said without preamble, once they were alone in what appeared to be Luca's private study. Victoria used to visit this house when she was married to Marco. Those visits stopped, and I understood why. Marco never spoke about what had happened, but we all knew. And then, years later, Luca told me about Catherine. And now he's telling me about you. Rosa settled into a chair with the deliberation of someone whose body carried the weight of decades. I've worked for this family since 1992. I came to them after my own family fell apart. They gave me structure when I needed it. They gave me purpose. But I also watched what this life does to people. I watched Marco love someone he couldn't keep. I watched Luca grow up understanding that loyalty was currency, and that money moved through channels most people never see. Why are you telling me this? Sophia asked. Because Luca wants to offer you a job, Rosa said. Not in any capacity that would involve illegal activity. He's funding a private medical laboratory that requires someone with forensic knowledge. Someone who can process evidence analysis for private clients. The work is legitimate. The money comes from legitimate sources. Or at least sources legitimate enough that they're not going to trigger federal scrutiny. He wants you to work there. He wants you to stop being a waitress and start being something more aligned with your capabilities. And if I refuse, then you continue as you are, Rosa said. But you'll be doing it under constant surveillance by federal agents. They'll be watching you, waiting for you to slip up or to make contact with Luca in ways they can use as evidence. They'll make your life difficult through legal channels, audits of your tax returns, inspections of Clearview's records, interviews with your coworkers that subtly suggest you're connected to criminal activity. Luca would prefer not to involve you in his operations, but if you're going to be connected to him anyway, he'd rather that connection be one he can control and protect. Sophia understood that what Rosa was describing was a choice with only one rational option. She could refuse and maintain her current precarious stability, or she could accept the offer and move into Luca's world with eyes open. "I accept," she said. The transition happened within a week. Sophia submitted her resignation at Marcello's, citing a better opportunity. She moved from her small apartment to a townhouse in Wynwood that Luca owned, a property located in a neighborhood that was actively gentrifying, surrounded by galleries and restaurants and people who minded their own business. The laboratory was located in a commercial building that appeared, from the outside, to be a routine medical facility. Inside, it was equipped with state-of-the-art forensic equipment and staffed by technicians who treated Sophia with professional courtesy, but did not attempt conversation beyond work-related matters. The salary was tripled from what she'd made at the restaurant. The work was intellectually engaging in ways waitressing had never been, but Sophia understood that she had traded one cage for another, albeit a more comfortable one. She could afford to increase Catherine's care. She could afford better treatment options. She could afford stability. The price was her independence. One evening, as she was completing analysis on a blood sample, Rosa appeared at her workstation. "Luca wants to introduce you to his business circle," Rosa said. "There's a dinner tomorrow evening at the house. Formal attire. Nothing too elaborate. You're his family now." It's time they understood that. Sophia felt her stomach tighten. "I don't know anything about business circles." "You know about observation," Rosa said. "You know about reading people. That's what matters. Tomorrow you'll sit at a table with people who operate in different worlds than the ones you've inhabited. You'll listen more than you speak. You'll understand that there are conversations happening beneath the surface of other conversations. And you'll begin to comprehend the scope of what Luca Ravellini actually is." The dinner was held in a private room that had been prepared with meticulous attention to detail. The table was set with crystal and silver. The food was prepared by a chef who had trained at restaurants Sophia could never afford to visit. The attendees were 6 men and 3 women, all of them carrying themselves with the particular confidence that came from operating in spaces where consequences were negotiable. Luca introduced Sophia as his family. No explanation was offered. No context provided. Just a statement of fact that seemed to shift how everyone at the table interacted with her. The conversation moved between business discussions that Sophia couldn't follow and personal anecdotes that revealed nothing, while implying vast networks of influence and obligation. What struck Sophia most was the careful civility of it all. These were dangerous people conducting themselves with the refinement of diplomats. They were discussing operations that almost certainly involved illegal activity, but they discussed them in language so coded and abstract that an outsider listening would have heard nothing but networking between legitimate business interests. Halfway through the meal, a man seated across from Sophia, someone Luca had introduced as Franco Giardoni, leaned toward her and smiled. "So you're the mystery that's captured Luca's attention," he said. His accent suggested Eastern European origins, but his English was fluent. Beautiful and connected to his family. That's a powerful combination. "I'm his family," Sophia said flatly. "That's all." "Of course," Franco said, though his smile suggested he understood more than she'd revealed. "Family is everything in this world. The people around this table, we're all bound by blood or obligation or debt. It's what keeps the system functioning. People who understand that loyalty to family supersedes loyalty to law. People who understand that certain rules exist outside legal frameworks." Luca appeared at Sophia's side before she could respond. His hand found the small of her back, and the gesture was both protective and territorial. "Sophia and I need to discuss something," he said to Franco. "If you'll excuse us." He led her from the dining room to his private study, where windows overlooked the garden that seemed to exist in its own climate zone, independent of the Miami weather beyond the property lines. "I need you to understand what you're witnessing," Luca said. "These people, Franco and the others, they exist in networks that move money through channels and methods that the legal system can't track or prevent. They operate with efficiency that legitimate business can't match because they're not constrained by ethics or law or consequences. Are you one of them?" Sophia asked. I am, Luca said simply. And because you're connected to me, you're now embedded in that world whether you wanted to be or not. The laboratory isn't just a place of employment. It's a front that allows me to operate in certain contexts. Your presence there legitimizes operations that would otherwise attract attention. You're not complicit in the crimes, Sophia, but you're not separate from them either. Sophia felt something fracture inside her chest, some wall between who she had been and who she was becoming. What if I didn't want this? She asked. Then you shouldn't have protected me when the FBI came asking questions, Luca said. His voice was not unkind, but it was absolute. You made a choice that night. You made it consciously or unconsciously, but you made it. And now you're living with the consequences of that choice. He paused, and his expression softened slightly. Rosa told me that you were conflicted about whether accepting the laboratory position made you complicit in criminal activity. I want you to understand something. You didn't create the world that contains organized crime and federal investigations and people like me. You were born into a family connected to that world whether you knew it or not. Victoria left it to protect her daughter. But you knew what you were walking into. You chose it anyway. And that choice, that conscious decision to stay, despite understanding the reality, that's what separates complicity from agency. I chose it because I didn't have a real alternative, Sophia said. That's what everyone says, Luca replied. That's what Marco said when he was entering the family business. That's what Victoria said when she was deciding to leave. That's what I said when I was deciding whether to stay. But the truth is that we all had alternatives. We just had to live with the consequences of taking them. You chose to stay in my orbit. Now you have to decide what that means for who you become. He moved to the window and stood with his hands in his pockets, looking out at the garden. I've been trying for 28 years to figure out how to navigate a life built on choices I didn't make, but couldn't undo. And now you're being asked to do the same thing. I can't make it easier for you. I can only promise that I'll protect you, and that your loyalty will be returned in kind. Sophia understood that what he was offering was not love in any conventional sense, but rather a form of family obligation that superseded sentiment. She understood that she had been woven into his world in ways that couldn't be unraveled, and she understood that the perfume Victoria had given her had been a key to unlock doors she'd never known existed, doors that now stood open and could not be closed. 6 months into her employment at the laboratory, Sophia had developed a rhythm that felt almost sustainable. The work was engaging. Her salary had been increased twice without her requesting it. Catherine's care had been upgraded to include private nurses and specialized therapies that had noticeably improved her mother's cognitive function on her better days. Sophia visited every Saturday and Wednesday, spending hours in Clearview's common room, sometimes talking to her mother about the present, sometimes just sitting in companionable silence while Catherine worked through the cognitive exercises that her care team had prescribed. But the arrangement with Luca had transformed in ways that Sophia struggled to categorize. He began appearing at the laboratory unannounced, ostensibly checking on operations, but really just to observe her working. He brought her coffee from a cafe she'd mentioned in passing conversation. He asked about her projects with genuine interest that went beyond casual inquiry. He invited her to dinners at his mansion, with increasing frequency, and those dinners had shifted from formal business gatherings to something more intimate, conversations between two people who were learning each other's minds as well as their histories. 3 weeks into October, Luca brought Franco Giardoni to one of those dinners. Franco was charming in a way that Sophia recognized as practiced, refined through years of operating in social contexts where attraction was a tool. He pulled out her chair. He asked about her work with apparent fascination. He complimented her dress in ways that walked the careful line between flattery and impropriety. "You're wasted in a laboratory," Franco said to her over the main course. His accent had softened over the months she'd known him, or perhaps she'd simply become more attuned to its cadences. "Someone with your intelligence, your observation skills, you could be doing so much more with your time." "I'm satisfied with what I'm doing," Sophia replied. "But satisfaction isn't ambition," Franco continued. "Satisfaction is comfort. It's stagnation dressed up as contentment. You should be thinking about expansion, about climbing toward positions of genuine influence within the organization." Luca set down his fork, with a deliberation that drew everyone's attention to the sound. Sophia's position is exactly where it needs to be, he said quietly. His tone suggested that disagreement would be unwise. She has the influence she requires. She has the respect of the people she works with. She has autonomy in her operational sphere. I don't see expansion as an improvement on those metrics. Franco smiled, but it was a smile that acknowledged defeat, without admitting it. Of course, he said. I was simply suggesting that unused potential is a tragedy, but perhaps I'm not the best judge of how her talents should be deployed. After dinner, as Franco was being escorted out by Rosa, Luca asked Sophia to join him in his study. She found him standing at the window again, that familiar posture that suggested he was carrying thoughts too heavy to voice while looking directly at another person. Franco is positioning himself to take over certain operations in the next few years, Luca said without preamble. He's intelligent and ruthless and willing to make the hard decisions that leadership requires. In another context, I might even approve of his ambitions. But I don't want him near you. Why not? Sophia asked. She genuinely didn't understand the objection. Luca turned to face her, and his expression was complicated. Frustration mixed with something else, something that Sophia couldn't quite identify. Because he'd use you. He'd see you as a way to strengthen his position within the organization, as a connection to me that might be exploited or leveraged. He'd present it as partnership, but it would be predation dressed up in courteous language. And you're different? Sophia asked. The question emerged before she could reconsider its implications. I am, Luca said flatly. Because I don't need to use you for advancement. I already have position and power. What I have with you is separate from those concerns. What I have with you is... He paused, seeming to struggle with word selection. It's something I've been trying to navigate for 6 months, and I don't think I've been entirely successful at maintaining appropriate boundaries. Sophia felt her heartbeat accelerate. What do you mean? I mean that you're my granddaughter biologically, but that connection exists in isolation from any emotional relationship I had with your mother or your grandmother, Luca said. His words were measured, chosen with care. I mean that I didn't raise you. I didn't know you as a child. I didn't form attachment to you through proximity and time and the accumulation of small moments that constitute parenting. I mean that when I look at you now, I see a woman who is intelligent and courageous and capable of navigating complexities that would destroy most people. I see someone who made a choice to stay connected to me despite understanding the implications of that choice. I see someone who I've developed attachments to that go beyond family obligation. Luca, Sophia began, but he held up a hand. I'm not asking you to reciprocate, he said. I'm simply stating a fact that I think you should understand. I'm stating it so that you understand why Franco needs to remain at a distance from you. Because if he were to approach you with the kind of attention he demonstrated tonight, and if you were to accept that attention, it would place you in a position of conflicted loyalty that I cannot allow. You can't control my choices, Sophia said, though she understood that in practical terms, his control was nearly absolute. No, Luca agreed, but I can make the consequences of certain choices clear. Franco would never be able to offer you what I can offer you. He would never be able to provide the kind of protection or certainty or freedom that my connection to you provides. He would always be calculating what your value is to him, what strategic advantage you represent. And I won't allow that. Over the following months, the boundaries Luca mentioned began to blur further. He started touching her in ways that went beyond familial interaction. A hand on the small of her back that lingered. A brush of fingers against her wrist when they were passing objects across a table. His gaze lingering on her in moments when he thought she wasn't observing him. Sophia found herself responding to these gestures, leaning into the proximity, allowing moments of nearness that stretched longer than propriety would typically allow. Rosa noticed. Rosa, who had known Luca for decades, and who seemed to exist in some liminal space between servant and confidant, began watching both of them with an expression that suggested she understood exactly what was happening and had formed opinions about it. One evening in December, as they were finishing dinner, Sophia heard herself say something that she'd been avoiding articulating for months. I don't think of you as my grandfather, she said. The statement emerged into silence, enormous and irreversible. Luca set down his glass very carefully. I know, he replied. I think about you as... Sophia paused, struggling with terminology that seemed inadequate for what she was experiencing. I think about you as someone I'm becoming attached to in ways that complicate the family structure that we're supposed to be inhabiting. I know that too, Luca said. And I'm terrified, Sophia continued, because I know who you are. I know what you do. I know that getting closer to you means becoming more entangled in operations and decisions and consequences that I didn't choose. But I also know that staying at a distance means ignoring something that feels increasingly significant. Luca stood and moved to the window. His silhouette was backlit by the Miami skyline, casting him in shadow. We need to take time, he said finally. We need to step back from this trajectory and give ourselves space to process what's happening. Because if we move forward, we're making a choice that alters the structure of everything we've built, and that choice needs to be made consciously, not in the heat of proximity and emotional intensity. How much time? Sophia asked. I don't know, Luca said, but you'll continue your work. You'll continue visiting your mother. You'll continue your life. And I'll maintain appropriate distance. When we see each other, we'll be cordial but restrained. And eventually, we'll understand whether this is genuine connection or proximity-induced attachment, whether this is something that can withstand the reality of what we actually are to each other. Sophia understood that what he was offering was not what she wanted in the immediate moment, but what she needed in the longer term. She understood that stepping back was an act of respect for both of them, an acknowledgement that the feelings were real enough to warrant careful consideration rather than impulsive action. And so she agreed, though agreeing felt like stepping backward into shadow when she'd been moving toward light. The distance between Sophia and Luca lasted through the winter and into the spring, a separation that felt both necessary and torturous. They inhabited the same spaces occasionally, dinners at his mansion where she would observe him from across rooms, their gazes meeting and then deliberately separating. She continued working at the laboratory. She continued visiting Catherine every Saturday and Wednesday. She continued her life in the townhouse in Wynwood, wearing the perfume Victoria had given her less frequently, trying to create psychological separation from the memory of what that scent represented. But separateness proved to be an illusion. Everything Sophia did was still filtered through the lens of Luca Ravellini. Her choices were still constrained by her connection to him. Her safety was still maintained by his network of protection. The distance was geographic and behavioral, but not actual. She was still embedded in his world. They had simply agreed to pretend otherwise. Then Catherine had a crisis. It was a Tuesday evening in late April when the call came from Clearview. Catherine had suffered a fall in her room. Minor injuries, nothing broken, but the incident had triggered a decline in her cognitive function that her medical team couldn't immediately reverse. Sophia left work immediately and drove to the facility, her hands shaking on the steering wheel, her mind fracturing with worry and guilt, and the terrible recognition that her mother's condition was deteriorating, regardless of the excellent care she was receiving. Catherine was awake when Sophia arrived, but she wasn't lucid. She was cycling through states of consciousness, moments of recognition interspersed with confusion and agitation. Sophia sat beside her bed and held her mother's hand, feeling the tremor in Catherine's fingers, the brittleness of her bones, the physical manifestation of her body's betrayal by disease. She's declining faster than we anticipated, Dr. Patterson explained as Sophia stepped out of the room. The fall appears to have accelerated something that was already in progression. We're adjusting her medication, but I want to be honest with you. We're moving into a different phase. We should discuss palliative care options. Clearview finalized the palliative plan on a rainless Tuesday. It wasn't surrender so much as a recalibration of hope, less about cures and more about dignity. Sophia signed the forms with steady hands. She told the nurse about the seashells Catherine used to collect when she could still walk the beach, and asked them to keep a small bowl by the window. When she stepped outside, the air smelled faintly of salt and disinfectant. She called her mother's room and let the silence fill with things that didn't need words. Sophia absorbed the words like blows. She understood what they meant. Her mother was dying. The expensive care and private nurses and specialized therapies had bought time, but they had not bought salvation. They had simply delayed the inevitable, while making it slightly more comfortable. She called Luca from the parking lot. She hadn't intended to. The number was muscle memory, fingers finding the digits before her conscious mind could intervene. He answered on the third ring, and his first words were, "Where are you?" "Clearview," she said. "My mother's worse. They think she's entered the terminal phase. I don't know how to process this." There was a pause, and then, "I'm coming to you." He arrived 40 minutes later, moving through the facility with the ease of someone accustomed to traversing any space without question. He found Sophia in Catherine's room, where she was sitting in the darkness, holding her mother's hand, watching the rise and fall of Catherine's chest as though monitoring that movement might somehow prevent it from ceasing entirely. Luca didn't speak. He simply pulled up another chair and sat beside her, and his presence, solid, real, undeniably present, broke whatever dam Sophia had been maintaining. She began to cry. Not the controlled release of emotion, but the fracturing collapse of someone who has been holding themselves together through sheer force of will. She cried for Catherine. She cried for Victoria. She cried for the complexity of her own existence, for the impossible choice she'd made to stay connected to Luca, for the realization that no amount of money or protection or love could actually save the people who mattered. Luca let her cry. He didn't speak. He didn't offer platitudes. He simply sat with her in the darkness, while her mother slept fitfully in the bed between them. By the following Saturday, Catherine had improved slightly. Not recovered, but stabilized enough to be lucid for periods of time. Sophia visited in the morning and found her mother having one of her better days, the kind where Catherine seemed almost like herself, where conversation was possible. "You're happy," Catherine said suddenly, observing Sophia with the clarity that came and went unpredictably. "You seem different, less burdened." "I'm not happy," Sophia said gently. "You're declining." "That's not happiness, but something's changed in you," Catherine continued. "Something's happened that's shifted the way you carry yourself. It's in your posture. It's in your face. You've let something in. Someone." Sophia didn't know how to respond to that observation, so she simply held her mother's hand and let the moment pass. That evening, Luca called. "I want to see you," he said. "Not at work. Not at the mansion. I want to see you somewhere that's only for us." He sent a car, and it brought her to a private marina on the outskirts of Miami. A boat was waiting, not one of the ostentatious yachts that the wealthy typically owned, but something smaller, more intimate. Luca was standing at the helm when she boarded, and he looked different. Less like a crime boss orchestrating operations, and more like a man who had removed the armor he typically wore. "I want to take you somewhere," he said. "Is that acceptable?" Sophia nodded, and he began maneuvering the boat away from the dock and out onto the black water. They sailed for hours, moving into deeper waters where the lights of Miami became distant, where the world seemed to consist only of the boat and the ocean, and the stars emerging as darkness deepened. Finally, he anchored in a location that appeared to be nowhere in particular, a patch of water indistinguishable from any other patch of water. "I've been trying to figure out how to navigate what we are," Luca said, standing at the rail with his hands in his pockets. "I've been trying to understand whether what I feel for you is genuine connection, or whether it's projection, expectation, the weight of decades waiting for someone to bridge the gap between who I am and who I wish I could be. And I still don't have a definitive answer, but I've come to understand that not having a definitive answer doesn't matter. What matters is that every moment I spend apart from you feels diminished by your absence. What matters is that you represent possibility in a life built entirely on inevitability. What matters is that you're real and present and worth every risk that comes with loving you." He turned to face her, and his expression was open in ways that Sophia had never seen before, vulnerability written across his features like language. "I can't offer you a normal life," he continued. "I can't offer you a future free from complication. What I can offer you is protection, loyalty, and a commitment that supersedes every other obligation I maintain. What I can offer you is the acknowledgement that you matter to me in ways that go beyond family or duty or strategic advantage. What I can offer you is myself, entirely, if you choose to accept that offer." He reached into his jacket and withdrew a small velvet box. Inside was a chain of gold, delicate but unmistakably valuable, with a pendant that contained a single drop of liquid, captured in crystal, suspended and preserved. "This is the original Perfume Ravellini," Luca said. "Isabella's formula. Marco brought it to me before he died, thinking I might understand what it meant. I've kept it for 28 years, waiting for the right moment to know what to do with it. But now I understand. It belongs with you. It belongs in the space between who you were and who you're becoming. It connects Isabella to Victoria to you, across generations and choices and heartbreak. It's the only thing I have that truly belongs to my family's history, and I'm giving it to you, because you've become the most important part of my history." Sophia took the necklace with trembling hands. The pendant was warm against her palm, and the perfume inside seemed to be alive, swirling slightly within its crystal prison. "I'm not asking you to marry me," Luca said. "I'm not asking you to formalize this through legal structures that would only create complication. I'm asking you to claim this necklace. I'm asking you to accept the commitment that it represents. I'm asking you to acknowledge that despite everything, despite who I am, despite what I do, despite the impossibility of our connection, you choose to stay. You choose me. You choose this." Sophia held the necklace against her chest, and she understood that this moment represented something definitive. This was the moment where she claimed ownership of her own choice. This was the moment where she stopped being pulled into Luca's world and started choosing to inhabit it. This was the moment where love became active rather than passive, where she became an agent in her own narrative, rather than a character carried along by circumstances beyond her control. "Yes," she said. "Yes to all of it." Luca moved toward her, and when he kissed her, it felt like a beginning rather than a continuation, like they were creating something new rather than surrendering to something inevitable. The kiss was not gentle, but it was deliberate, filled with intention and acknowledgement. When they parted, Sophia could still taste the salt from the ocean air and the particular flavor of possibility. He fastened the necklace around her throat, and the pendant settled against her skin, warm and real. She could smell the perfume even through the crystal, the same scent that Victoria had worn, that Isabella had created, that Luca had carried for decades. The perfume that had started this entire chain of events, that had been the key to unlock doors Sophia had never known existed. "I love you," Luca said. The statement was simple and absolute. "I have loved you since I inhaled your perfume in that restaurant and realized that Victoria had kept her promise, that the legacy she entrusted to you was going to survive beyond her. I have loved you through every moment of distance and every moment of proximity. I love you now, and I will continue to love you for whatever future we manage to construct together." They stayed on the boat through the night, and when the sun began to rise, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink that seemed almost impossible in their beauty, Sophia understood that her life had become a story that would never fit into the ordinary categories of human experience. She was the daughter of a woman who had escaped organized crime. She was the granddaughter of a man who had chosen to let her exist outside his world. She was the partner of a man who operated in darkness but had chosen to bring her into the light. She was wearing a perfume that had been created in secrecy and carried as a symbol across generations. And she was alive, fully and completely alive, in a way that she had never been before the night she applied Victoria's perfume to her skin and walked into a Miami restaurant. When they returned to shore, Luca took her to Clearview. They visited Catherine together, and Catherine, in one of her moments of unexpected lucidity, saw the necklace and understood what it meant. "She gave you the perfume," Catherine said to Luca. "Victoria gave you the perfume. That means you knew her. That means you were part of our family's story." "I was," Luca confirmed. "Your daughter has chosen to let me be part of it going forward." Catherine nodded, and Sophia saw something in her mother's expression that might have been peace. "Then you take care of her," Catherine said. "You take care of her the way Victoria took care of me. That's how the perfume works. That's what it represents. Care across the distances that separate us. Love that survives the impossible." In the months that followed, Catherine's decline continued, but she was surrounded by the best care available. and in her final days, she seemed to carry a lightness that had not been present before, as though knowing that Sophia was safe, that Sophia had found someone willing to commit to her protection, made the process of letting go slightly easier. When Catherine died on a Tuesday morning in late June, Sophia was holding her hand, and Luca was sitting in the chair beside her, a physical manifestation of his commitment. After the funeral, after the practical arrangements, after the immediate rawness of grief had begun its transformation into something more manageable, Sophia stood on the balcony of Luca's mansion and touched the perfume necklace against her throat. The scent of amber and cedar and nameless flowers rose to meet her, carrying with it the weight of generations, the sacrifice of women who had loved and lost and protected the ones who came after them, carrying with it the possibility of something new, something that honored what had come before, while refusing to remain bound by it. Luca appeared beside her, and they stood in silence, watching the Miami evening descend, watching the city transform into a landscape of lights and shadows. The perfume Ravellini hung around them both, connecting them to history and to each other, an invisible chain linking the past to the present, to whatever future they would construct together. "I never thought I would have this," Luca said quietly. "I never thought I would have you." "Neither did I," Sophia replied. "Neither did Victoria. Neither did Isabella. But they gave us the perfume anyway. They gave us a way to find each other. They gave us a language that transcended time and separation and blood and choice." She turned to face him, and he was watching her with an expression that contained entire libraries of emotion, love and regret and gratitude, and the particular intensity of someone who had spent decades believing that certain things were impossible before discovering that they were not. "We're going to build something," Sophia said. "Not a traditional family, not a criminal empire. Something that honors both of our histories while refusing to be bound by them." "Yes," Luca agreed. "That's exactly what we're going to build." And in the Miami evening, surrounded by the machinery of organized crime and the architecture of impossible love, they began the work of transforming choice into commitment, transforming connection into legacy, transforming the perfume that had brought them together into something that would endure long after both of them had become part of history themselves.